The Tuesday morning sun poured through the terrace doors like liquid gold, beautiful and blinding. No one saw the scope glinting in the rose garden. No one except the maid who walked past the mafia boss and locked death outside. The Bocelli estate didn't look like a fortress. That was the point. Perched on 12 acres of manicured grounds in upstate New York, the property presented itself as old money elegance. Cream-colored stone, tall windows that caught the morning light, rose gardens that bloomed in defiant bursts of crimson and white. Inside, the hallways smelled of lemon polish and something older, heavier. Power. The kind that didn't need to announce itself because it had already carved its name into the bones of the house generations ago. At 26, Scarlett Reiner had been scrubbing those bones for 18 months. She moved through the East Wing corridor with her supplies cart, her footsteps muffled by thick, crimson Persian runners woven with ancient patterns. Her uniform was simple. A collared shirt in neutral beige, pressed but not pristine, practical dark slacks, and shoes worn soft from miles walked on marble and hardwood. Her dark hair was pulled back tight from her face, every strand controlled, every detail designed to make her forgettable. She'd perfected the art of being a ghost. It wasn't a skill she'd chosen. It was survival. In estates like this, in families like the Bocellis, the staff who lasted were the ones who knew how to disappear. You anticipated needs before they were spoken. You heard conversations without listening. You saw everything and remembered nothing. Scarlett had learned this the way some people learn to swim, thrown into deep water with the choice to adapt or drown. She'd been on her feet since 4 that morning. The leather of her shoes had molded to her feet months ago, but the ache was still there, a dull throb that climbed from her heels to her lower back. She didn't let it show on her face. She'd learned to wear neutrality like armor, a pleasant blankness that made her part of the furniture. But this morning, something felt different. Scarlett couldn't identify what had shifted in the estate's usual rhythm. The household had its patterns. She knew them intimately. The Don took his coffee at 6. The guards rotated shifts at 7 and 3. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, did her rounds at 8:30, checking that every surface gleamed, every corner passed inspection. It was Tuesday. Territory meetings happened on Tuesdays. But her instincts, honed by years of reading rooms and surviving by staying 3 steps ahead of trouble, told her to pay attention. She paused outside the private study, adjusting the coffee service on her cart. The double doors were 12 feet tall, heavy mahogany that swallowed sound. Through the crack where they didn't quite meet, she could see slivers of golden light. The study faced east, with massive glass doors that opened onto the terrace and the rose garden beyond. This time of morning, the sun turned everything inside into amber and shadow. She knocked. 2 soft taps. "Come." The voice was low, controlled. She recognized it immediately. Christopher Bocelli didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. At 35, the Don commanded the kind of respect that came from power held close to the chest, measured out in glances and silences that cut deeper than threats. Scarlett pushed the door open with her shoulder, guiding the cart through. The study hit her senses all at once. The smell of old leather and older wood, the faint burn of expensive cologne, sandalwood, and something cold, like winter air brought indoors. And underneath it, almost imperceptible, the sharp tang of nervous sweat. Christopher Bocelli stood near the windows, his back to the light. Tailored charcoal suit, dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from stone, all sharp angles and controlled intensity. There was a tattoo on the left side of his neck, barely visible above his collar, a stylized key or blade that marked him as something more than just wealth and power. But it was his eyes that always arrested her when she had to meet them, dark, intelligent, and constantly calculating. Even now, mid-conversation, she felt his gaze track her entrance for a fraction of a second before returning to his guest. Stefano Russo sat across from him, one of the capos, 40-something, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was talking about territory, about expansion into the docks. His hands moved as he spoke, gesturing, but there was tension in the set of his jaw. The coffee service sat on the side table between them, untouched. 2 cups, the silver sugar bowl, the cream pitcher catching light like captured moonlight. Scarlett moved like water through the room. She approached the side table, her movements practiced and efficient. She reached for the coffee pot, preparing to pour. That's when she saw Stefano's hand. He'd shifted in his seat, leaning forward as if engaged in the conversation, but his fingers had dipped into his jacket pocket, something small palmed in his hand. And then, With a casual gesture that would have fooled anyone not trained to watch for sleight of hand, he dropped something into the sugar bowl, a quick stir with the spoon. His attention never left Christopher's face. Scarlett's pulse spiked, but her hands remained steady. She poured the first cup, black for Christopher. She set it on the desk within his reach, the fine china making no sound against the leather mat. Then she poured the second cup. Stefano took his black. Everyone knew that. She'd served him a dozen times over the past year. She reached for the cream pitcher, blocking Stefano's view of Christopher's cup with her body. But in the reflection of the silver pot, she saw his hand move, a quick, subtle flick of his wrist over Christopher's cup, a fine powder dissolving instantly into the dark liquid. He had poisoned the Dawn's coffee while she turned to get the cream he didn't even use. And in that moment, as she set the pitcher down, she made her choice. She picked up Christopher's poisoned coffee and placed it in front of Stefano. Then she took the clean cup and set it on Christopher's desk. It happened in 3 seconds. Smooth, invisible, the kind of move a ghost could make without disturbing the air. Stefano didn't notice. He was too busy watching Christopher's face, waiting for something, waiting for the moment the Dawn would take that first sip, and the powder would start its work. Scarlett stepped back, her expression blank, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. And that's when she noticed Stefano's eyes. They flicked away from Christopher, just for a second, toward the terrace, then back, then away again. A tell, a nervous tick that didn't match the confidence in his voice. Scarlett followed his gaze. The terrace doors, 12 feet of mahogany and bulletproof glass, framed by floor-length curtains that hung like sheets of cream silk. They were always kept sealed. Always. The estate's security protocol was ironclad, but as the light shifted, as dust motes danced in the golden shaft of sun pouring through the windows, she saw it. The latch was undone. Her heart kicked once, hard against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe normally, to keep her expression blank, and then she looked through the glass. The rose garden outside was ablaze with color, red blooms catching the morning sun, the gravel paths, the marble fountain. And there, barely visible through the leaves of the hedge, a glint of metal, small, precise, a scope, a sniper's scope. Scarlett's mind didn't freeze. It never did. That particular survival mechanism had been stripped from her 12 years ago, the night she hid in her father's study closet and listened to him die. She'd been 14, small enough to fold herself behind the winter coats that still smelled like his cigars. The gunman had stood 3 feet away, reloading. She'd pressed her hands over her mouth to trap the sound of her breathing, and she'd heard him say it, cold and final. Anyone who speaks, dies. Her father had been consigliere to the old Don, Christopher's father, loyal until the second the bullet entered his skull. Scarlett had learned that night that silence wasn't weakness. Silence was the only currency that bought you another sunrise. Her mind moved faster than her pulse. If she screamed, Stefano would know she'd seen it. If the doors opened, they'd both be dead before Christopher could draw his weapon. The only way to stop this was to make sure those doors never opened at all. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She walked, past Stefano, who was mid-sentence about profit margins and shipping routes, past Christopher, who stood with his arms crossed, his attention fixed on the capo's face. Christopher's hand hovered near his coffee cup, about to lift it to his lips. She moved with the same unhurried grace she'd used for 18 months, as though she were simply tidying the room, and then she stepped between Christopher Bocelli and the terrace doors. Her hand found the heavy brass deadbolt. She engaged it. Click. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Then she lifted the security bar from its bracket and dropped it into place across the door. Thud. Solid. Final. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Stefano stopped talking. His face went white, then red. His hand moved toward his jacket, toward the antidote he carried for the poison he thought was in Christopher's cup. But his fingers froze when he saw Christopher's expression. The Don's hand had moved away from the coffee cup. His weapon cleared his shoulder holster in a blur of motion, the suppressor already attached. Christopher's eyes locked on Scarlett's reflection in the glass. He saw her there, standing between him and the terrace, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. And in that split second, he understood. She hadn't locked the danger out. She'd locked the traitor in. Stefano lunged from his chair, desperation overriding training. The shot was a muffled thump, intimate and deadly. Stefano's shoulder exploded in a spray of red. He hit the floor hard, gasping, his gun skittering across the polished wood. Outside, the crack of a rifle echoed through the garden. The bulletproof glass shuddered but held. A spiderweb of cracks bloomed where the sniper's shot had struck, right where Christopher's head would have been if he'd been standing by the open door. Christopher didn't lower his weapon. He stepped over Stefano's writhing body, his expensive leather shoes leaving prints in the spreading pool of blood, and stopped 2 feet from Scarlett. She could see the pulse hammering in his throat, the only sign that he was human and not carved from ice. His eyes searched her face, cataloging every detail, every micro-expression she'd spent years learning to hide. The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Stefano groaned on the floor, clutching his shoulder, his breath coming in wet gasps. But Christopher's attention didn't waver. When he spoke, his voice was soft, dangerous, controlled. "Don't move." He wasn't talking to Stefano. Scarlett didn't move, couldn't move. Christopher Bocelli stood close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could smell the gunpowder mixing with his cologne. The weapon in his hand remained steady, angled down toward Stefano, but not quite away from her. She watched his jaw work, muscle ticking beneath the sharp line of bone. He was recalculating. Every assumption he'd made about her, every time she'd poured his coffee or polished his desk or disappeared into the walls of his house like smoke, all of it was being reassessed in real time. Behind him, Stefano made a wet, gasping sound. Christopher's eyes narrowed, but he didn't turn. "Shoulder wound shouldn't sound like that," he said, more to himself than to her. The observation was clinical, detached. He'd seen men die. He knew what a bullet to the shoulder did and didn't do. This wasn't right. Stefano's gasping turned to choking, a horrible, rattling sound that clawed its way up from his chest. His good hand scrabbled at his throat, fingers digging into skin, leaving red scratches. His eyes bulged. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Christopher finally looked back, his weapon tracking to cover the fallen man, but his expression shifted from cold control to confusion. "What the hell?" Scarlett's voice came out quieter than she intended. "It's not the bullet." Christopher's head snapped back to her. "What?" She forced herself to meet his eyes, forced herself to speak through the terror that had wrapped around her throat like wire. "Your cup. He tampered with it when you weren't looking. He put something in it." She swallowed. Her mouth was desert dry. "I saw him, so I switched the cups." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Stefano's choking seemed to fade into white noise. Christopher stared at her, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze dropped to the desk, to the 2 coffee cups, one black, one with cream that had long since gone cold. His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. When he looked back at her, something had shifted in his eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but recognition, the kind that made her skin prickle with awareness. "You switched the cups," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Yes." He poisoned his own coffee. "Yes. And you didn't say a word." "I couldn't. If I'd screamed, he would have known I'd seen the sniper. The doors would have opened. You'd both be dead." Christopher holstered his weapon in a smooth, practiced motion. He took a step closer, then another. Scarlett's back hit the terrace door, the security bar pressing into her spine. He didn't stop until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. The heat radiating off him was almost overwhelming, a living thing that made the air between them thick and charged. She could see the pulse hammering in his throat, could see the way his pupils had dilated, black swallowing brown. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, scraped raw. "Scarlett Reiner. I work here. I clean your study every Tuesday and Friday." That's not what I'm asking." He braced one hand against the door beside her head, leaning in. The tattoo on his neck was close enough to touch. Up close, she could see it was a skeleton key, the bow shaped like a crown. Maids don't anticipate assassinations. They don't swap poisoned cups without flinching. They don't lock doors and trap killers in rooms. His free hand came up, fingers hovering near her jaw but not quite touching. "So I'm going to ask you again. Who are you?" Scarlett's heart was a war drum against her ribs. She could feel the tremor in her hands, the way her knees threatened to buckle. But she'd survived this long by holding her ground when running would get her killed. "I'm someone who's seen enough death to recognize it coming." His fingers finally made contact, the barest brush against her jaw. His skin was warm, calloused. The touch sent electricity down her spine. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question. It was an observation that seemed to fascinate him. "I'm terrified of you," she corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if I run." Something flickered across his face. Respect. Maybe. Or intrigue. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slow and deliberate. and she hated the way her body responded, the way heat pooled low in her stomach, despite the dead man bleeding out 10 feet away. "You saved my life," he said. "Twice. In 5 minutes. I locked a door and moved some cups. That's all. That's everything." His hand dropped away, but he didn't step back. The space between them was still too small, still charged with something dangerous. "You saw the threat. You neutralized it. And you did it without hesitation." He tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. "Why?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it. Why had she done it? The honest answer was that she didn't know. Instinct, maybe, or some buried sense of debt to the family her father had died serving. Or maybe she was just tired of watching powerful men destroy each other while the invisible people cleaned up the blood. "Because I could," she said finally. Because standing there and doing nothing felt worse than the risk. Behind them, Stefano gave one last, rattling gasp, and went still. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Christopher didn't look back. His eyes stayed locked on hers, dark and intense, and far too knowing. "You have secrets," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, and I'm going to find out what they are. Scarlett tried to move, tried to slide along the door toward the exit, but he shifted with her, blocking her path with his body. Not threatening, not quite, but making it clear that she wasn't leaving until he allowed it. "I need to go," she said, hating how her voice wavered. You need to stay exactly where you are." His hand caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, and she knew he could feel how fast her heart was racing. "You just made yourself a target, Scarlett." Every associate Stefano had, every family member looking for someone to blame. They're going to come looking for answers. And you just became the biggest question mark in this house. The estate alarm blared to life, a shrieking wail that made her flinch. Red emergency lights began to strobe in the hallway beyond the study doors. Voices shouted in Italian. Commands barked over radios. The sniper was gone, but the threat was far from over. Christopher's grip on her wrist tightened, not enough to hurt but enough to anchor her. His eyes bored into hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "You don't leave this room unless it's with me. Do you understand?" Scarlett's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, wanted to rip her hand free and disappear back into the walls where she belonged, but the weight of his stare, the certainty in his voice, told her that her days of being invisible were over. She'd stepped out of the shadows, and now there was no going back. "I understand," she whispered. He nodded once, sharp and final, but he didn't let go of her wrist, and as the alarm screamed and footsteps pounded in the hall, Scarlett realized with cold, absolute clarity that she'd just traded one kind of cage for another. Christopher didn't release her wrist. He pulled her toward the study doors with the kind of authority that didn't ask for compliance. It demanded it. Scarlett stumbled, her legs unsteady beneath her, but his grip kept her upright. The hallway beyond was chaos. Guards sprinted past, weapons drawn, radios crackling with terse Italian commands. The emergency lights painted everything in strobing red, turning faces into masks, shadows into threats. No one looked at her. They were too focused on securing perimeters, locking down exits, hunting for the sniper who'd already vanished into the woods. Christopher moved through the chaos like a blade through water, parting the current with nothing more than his presence. He didn't speak to the guards, didn't issue orders. He didn't need to. They saw him and adjusted, creating a corridor that led them down the back stairwell toward the estate's private garage. Scarlett's mind raced, trying to catalog exits, trying to find the moment she could slip away and disappear the way she always had. But his hand on her wrist was an anchor, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that running would only make things worse. The garage was cool and dim, the air thick with the smell of concrete and motor oil. A black SUV waited, engine already running, rear door open. Christopher guided her inside with a hand on the small of her back, the touch firm but not rough. She slid across the leather seat, and he followed, closing the door behind them with a solid thunk that sealed them into sudden, suffocating silence. The driver pulled out without a word, the vehicle gliding through the garage's security gate and onto the private road that wound through the estate's perimeter. Scarlett pressed herself against the far door, putting as much distance between them as the confined space allowed. Christopher didn't crowd her. He settled into his seat, pulling a tablet from the console between them, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. The glow illuminated his face in sharp relief, highlighting the hard line of his jaw, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He looked like he belonged in Renaissance paintings, all brutal beauty and controlled violence. "Scarlett Reiner," he said without looking up. His voice was flat, clinical. 26. Hired 18 months ago through a staffing agency. Previous employment at a hotel in Manhattan. References checked out. Background clean. He paused, scrolling. Too clean. Scarlett's pulse kicked. She kept her face neutral, kept her breathing steady. But her hands betrayed her, fingers twisting together in her lap. Christopher's eyes flicked up from the screen, tracking the movement. He saw too much. Always had. "I ran a deeper search," he continued. "Cross-referenced your social security number, your birth certificate, your employment history." He tilted the tablet so she could see the screen. A photograph stared back at her. A man in his 40s, dark-haired and serious, wearing a suit that spoke of old money and older loyalties. Antonio Reiner, my father's consigliere, executed 12 years ago for suspected treason. His gaze locked on hers, sharp as broken glass. "Your father." The air left her lungs. She'd known this moment would come eventually. She'd known the second she locked that door that her invisibility was shattered. But hearing him say it, hearing her father's name spoken aloud in that cold, measured tone, made something crack open inside her chest. "You knew who I was when you hired me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. You slipped through the cracks. A clerical error, a misspelled name on your application. You shouldn't have made it past the first interview." He set the tablet aside, his full attention on her now. "So tell me, Scarlett, why would the daughter of a dead traitor come work in the house where her father was killed?" "He wasn't a traitor." The words came out harder than she intended, edged with years of buried grief and rage. "My father thought otherwise." "Your father was wrong." The silence that followed was electric. Christopher's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of uncertainty, maybe, or curiosity. "Then why didn't you come forward? Why hide in plain sight, scrubbing floors and serving coffee?" "Because coming forward would have gotten me killed." She forced herself to hold his gaze, even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "I needed to survive, and survival meant staying invisible." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, closing the distance between them. "In the study, when you saw the sniper, you didn't scream, you didn't panic. Most people would have frozen, would have made noise, would have gotten everyone killed." His head tilted, studying her like she was a puzzle with missing pieces. "Why didn't you scream?" The question hit her like a fist to the sternum. Her breath caught, her vision narrowed, and suddenly she wasn't in the SUV anymore. She was 14 years old, folded into the back of her father's study closet, her knees pulled to her chest, her hand pressed so hard over her mouth that her teeth cut into her palm. The gunshot had been deafening. Her father's body had hit the floor with a sound she'd never forget, heavy and final. She'd heard the killer's boots on the hardwood, heard him check the pulse that was no longer there. And then he'd spoken, his voice casual, almost bored. "Anyone who speaks, dies." The closet door had been 3 feet away. She'd stayed silent, she'd stayed hidden, and she'd listened to him leave, listened to the house go quiet, listened to her father's blood seep under the door and darken the hem of her dress. "Scarlett." Christopher's voice pulled her back, rough and urgent. His hand was on her knee, the touch grounding her, anchoring her to the present. "Where did you go?" She blinked, her vision clearing. He was closer now, close enough that she could see the concern etched into the lines around his eyes. "I was in the closet," she heard herself say. "When they killed him, I was hiding. And the man who did it, he said that anyone who speaks dies. So I didn't speak. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound." Her voice cracked. "I've been silent ever since." Christopher's jaw clenched. His hand remained on her knee, warm and solid. "You were a child. I was a witness." She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. And witnesses don't last long in this world. Something shifted in his expression. The hard edges softened, the suspicion giving way to something she couldn't quite name. Respect? Maybe. Or recognition. He understood survival. He understood what it cost. "You're not a child anymore," he said quietly. "And you're not invisible. Not to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Scarlett didn't know how to respond, didn't know what he wanted from her, but before she could find her voice, the vehicle slowed, turning onto a gravel drive that crunched under the tires. Through the tinted windows, she could see a low, concrete structure half buried in the hillside, No windows, steel door. Security cameras sweeping the perimeter like mechanical sentries. "We're here," Christopher said, his hand finally leaving her knee. The loss of contact felt like cold water. The driver opened the door. Christopher exited first, his movements fluid and controlled, and extended a hand to help her out. Scarlett took it, her legs shaky as she stepped onto the gravel. The air outside was different, cooler, but wrong somehow. She breathed in and her lungs rejected it. Stale, recycled, like air that had been trapped and reused too many times. Christopher moved toward the steel door, punching a code into the keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. He pushed the door open, gesturing for her to enter. Scarlett stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the dim interior. Emergency lighting flickered on, illuminating a hallway lined with reinforced concrete. Christopher followed, the door sealing behind them with a sound like a tomb closing. And that's when she smelled it. Not fresh air, not ventilation, just stale ozone and dust, the scent of a space that hadn't breathed in years. Her eyes tracked to the ceiling, to the ventilation grates that should have been pulling air, should have been circulating oxygen. They were sealed, painted over, useless. Scarlett's hand shot out, gripping Christopher's arm hard enough that her nails dug into the fabric of his suit. He looked down at her, surprise flickering across his face. "What? This isn't a safe house," she whispered, her voice tight with dawning horror. "It's a tomb." Christopher's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Before Scarlett could answer, the steel door behind them slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. The electronic lock engaged, multiple bolts sliding into place with mechanical precision. Then the lights cut out. Not a flicker, not a fade, just absolute, suffocating darkness that swallowed them whole. Christopher's hand found her arm in the blackness, his grip tight. "Stay close." His voice was steady, controlled, but she heard the edge beneath it. He understood now. She felt him move, heard his footsteps on the concrete as he made his way back toward the door. The sound of his palm slamming against steel echoed through the space. "It's sealed, mag-locked." A pause, then the unmistakable click of him trying his phone. No signal. The walls are too thick. Scarlett's breathing was too loud in the dark. Her pulse hammered in her ears, her throat tightening with the beginnings of panic. But panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not now, not when Christopher needed her to think. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to push past the terror clawing at her chest. "Your mother," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You said she suggested this location. Years ago. After my father died. She said every dawn needed a contingency, a place no one could reach." His footsteps returned to her, his hand finding her shoulder in the dark. "She planned this. She's been planning it for years." The temperature was already rising. Without ventilation, without air circulation, the bunker was becoming an oven. Scarlett could feel sweat beginning to bead at her temples, could feel the air growing thick and stale in her lungs. They had minutes, maybe less, before the oxygen levels dropped to dangerous levels. "My father," she said suddenly, her mind racing. "He used to talk about the old estates, the ones built during Prohibition. They all had tunnels, hidden routes for smuggling liquor when the feds came knocking." Christopher's hand tightened on her shoulder. "You think there's a tunnel here? I think if there is, it's our only chance." He didn't hesitate. His phone screen flared to life, a weak blue glow that barely pushed back the darkness but was enough to see by. He swept the light across the room, illuminating concrete walls, a single cot, shelves stocked with canned goods and bottled water, a prison disguised as a refuge. The light landed on the far wall where a metal rack held dusty wine bottles, relics from another era. "There," Scarlett said, moving toward it. "Help me move this." They worked in tandem, Christopher gripping one side of the rack while Scarlett took the other. The metal scraped against concrete, a sound that set her teeth on edge. Behind it, barely visible in the dim light, was a seam in the wall. A hatch, small and square, sealed with a rusted latch. Christopher handed her the phone and worked the latch with both hands, muscles straining beneath his suit jacket. It gave with a groan of protesting metal, and the hatch swung inward, revealing a black maw that descended into nothing. "Ladies first," he said, and there was dark humor in his voice, the kind born from men who'd stared death down and learned to laugh at it. "Age before beauty," Scarlett shot back, surprising herself. His teeth flashed white in the darkness, a brief grin that made something flutter in her chest despite the terror. He went first, lowering himself into the opening, his shoulders barely fitting through. Scarlett followed, her hands finding the rough ladder rungs, her feet searching for purchase in the dark. The air below was cooler but dank, smelling of earth and decay and old secrets. Christopher's hand caught her waist as she descended, steadying her when her foot slipped on a rung slick with moisture. The contact sent heat through her despite the chill, his palm burning through the thin fabric of her shirt. The tunnel at the bottom was barely high enough to crouch in, the walls pressing close on either side. Christopher led the way, his phone light casting weak shadows that danced and twisted. Scarlett followed, one hand on his shoulder for balance, for connection, for the reassurance that she wasn't alone in the dark. She could feel the tension in his muscles, could feel the controlled power in the way he moved. His hand kept drifting back to her, checking that she was still there, fingers brushing her arm, her hip, her hand. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing them to crawl. The concrete gave way to packed earth and old brick, the ceiling so low that Scarlett's back scraped against it. Her breath came faster, the walls pressing in, and she felt the first real stab of claustrophobia. Christopher must have sensed it because his hand found hers in the dark, his fingers lacing through hers, anchoring her. "Stay with me," he said. And it wasn't a command. It was a plea. They crawled for what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the darkness absolute, the only sounds their breathing and the scrape of their bodies against stone. Then Christopher stopped so suddenly she collided with him, her face pressing into his back. She felt him tense, heard him curse. Beam. The ceilings collapsed ahead. Scarlett squeezed past him in the narrow space, their bodies pressed together in the dark, every point of contact electric. She ran her hands over the obstruction, feeling for gaps, for weakness. "Here. There's space on the right. But it's unstable. Let me go first. You're too broad. You'll bring the whole thing down." Before he could argue, she was moving, sliding through the gap, her shirt catching on splintered wood, her shoulder scraping against brick. She heard the groan of shifting weight, felt the beam shudder. Then Christopher's hand was there, gripping her ankle, pulling her through just as the section behind her collapsed with a thunderous crash. Dust choked the air. Scarlett's ears rang. Strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against a solid chest, and she realized Christopher had dragged her clear, had shielded her body with his own. They were pressed together in the darkness, his heart hammering against her back, his breath hot against her neck. "You could have been killed," he said, and there was something raw in his voice, something unguarded. "So could you." She turned in his arms, her hands finding his face in the dark, feeling for injuries. Her fingers met warm skin, the rough stubble on his jaw, the sharp line of his cheekbone, and then his hand caught hers, and she felt the wet warmth of blood. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. Let me see." She tore a strip from the hem of her shirt, wrapping it around the gash on his palm where the beam had caught him. Her fingers worked carefully, tying the makeshift bandage, and she felt him watching her even though she couldn't see his face. The intimacy of the moment settled over them, heavy and charged. His free hand came up, cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek. Scarlett. Her name was a question and a statement, rough with something she didn't dare name. The space between them disappeared. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe they both did. But then his mouth was on hers, and the darkness didn't matter anymore because she could feel everything. The pressure of his lips, the taste of him, salt and coffee and desperation. His hand slid into her hair, tilting her head back, deepening the kiss until she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, foreheads pressed together, the barrier between boss and maid had shattered completely. What remained was just two people who'd survived the dark together and found something neither of them expected. "Come on," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Let's get out of this tomb." They crawled the rest of the way together, and when they finally pushed through the exit hatch and emerged into the woods miles from the bunker, the night air hit Scarlett's lungs like ice water. She collapsed onto the pine needles, gasping, her whole body shaking with relief and adrenaline. Christopher dropped beside her, his chest heaving, his hand still tangled with hers. After a moment he stood, pulling her up with him. He scanned the perimeter, his body tense, alert. Then he froze. Scarlett followed his gaze to the base of a tree, where something glinted in the moonlight. Christopher moved toward it, crouching down, his fingers closing around a small brass object, a shell casing. He held it up to the light, studying the markings stamped into the metal. His face went pale. His hand started to shake. "Impossible," he whispered, and the word was broken, devastated. He looked at Scarlett, and in his eyes she saw something that terrified her more than the tomb, More than the sniper, more than any of it, she saw a man whose world had just shattered. This casing, this marking. It belonged to my brother. His voice cracked. It belonged to Julian. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel perched 40 stories above the city. Christopher had made a single call from a burner phone he'd pulled from a hollow tree near the tunnel exit, and 20 minutes later a car had arrived with a driver who asked no questions. Now they stood in the living room, facing a panoramic wall of glass, overlooking a glittering sprawl of lights that seemed to stretch forever. The space was modern, cold, impersonal, a place designed for function, not comfort. Scarlett recognized it for what it was, a bolt hole, somewhere his mother wouldn't know about. Christopher stood at the windows, the shell casing still clutched in his fist. He hadn't spoken since they'd gotten into the car, hadn't looked at her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what he'd discovered. Scarlett watched him from across the room, saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched. He was holding himself together through sheer force of will, but she could see the cracks forming. Julian was 23 when he died, Christopher said finally, his voice flat, emotionless. 3 years ago, there was a boating accident off the coast. They found the wreckage, found his jacket, found blood, never found his body. But the Coast Guard said the currents were too strong, that he'd been swept out to sea. He turned from the window, his eyes hollow. I mourned him. I buried an empty casket. I watched my mother weep at the funeral and thought it broke her. A bitter laugh escaped him. She didn't weep for his death. She wept because she'd just weaponized her own son. Scarlett's chest tightened. She'd known grief, known loss, but this was something different. This was betrayal on a scale that defied comprehension. She faked his death, she said quietly, to turn him against you. She must have convinced him I was the one who tried to kill him, that I wanted him gone so there'd be no competition for the throne. Christopher moved to the bar, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey into a crystal tumbler. The bottle rattled against the glass. Julian was gentle. He hated this life, hated the violence. He wanted out. He was going to leave, start over somewhere clean. His voice cracked, and she took that kindness and twisted it into a weapon aimed at my head. The tumbler shattered in his grip. Blood welled from his palm, mixing with the whiskey, dripping onto the marble counter. Christopher stared at it like he didn't recognize it as his own. Scarlett moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 strides. She caught his hand, pulling him toward the kitchen sink, turning on the cold water and guiding his bleeding palm under the stream. Glass fragments glittered in the wound. She picked them out carefully, her fingers steady even as her heart hammered. I have no one, Christopher said, and the words were raw, stripped of every defense he'd ever built. My father's dead. My brother's been turned into a killer who wants me dead. My mother orchestrated all of it. The family I've bled for, killed for, sacrificed everything for, they're the ones holding the knife. He looked down at her, and the devastation in his eyes made her chest ache. I'm alone. Scarlett dried his hand with a kitchen towel, wrapping it around the cuts to stanch the bleeding. Then she lifted her other hand and touched the tattoo on his neck, that stylized skeleton key with the crown. She felt him go still under her touch, felt the rapid flutter of his pulse beneath her fingertips. You're not alone, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. You have me. His hand came up, covering hers, pressing her palm flat against his skin. The heat of him burned through her. You barely know me. I know you're not your mother. I know you're not your father. I know you stood between me and a bullet. And I know you held my hand in the dark when I was terrified. She stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. I know that's enough. Something shifted in his expression. The walls he kept so carefully constructed crumbled, and what remained was just a man who'd been broken and was trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. His hand slid from hers to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. You should run from me, Scarlett. Everyone around me ends up dead or broken. Then I guess we'll be broken together. She didn't know where the words came from, didn't know when she'd decided that this man, this dangerous, devastated man, was worth the risk. But standing there with his blood on her hands and his heart laid bare, she knew she wasn't walking away. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was air, desperate, consuming, his hand fisted in her hair, angling her head back, and she opened for him, tasting whiskey and copper and the sharp edge of grief. They stumbled backward until her spine hit the counter, and his body pressed against hers, solid and warm and alive. This wasn't the careful exploration in the tunnel. This was raw need, Two people clinging to each other in the wreckage of their worlds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he said, and it wasn't a command. It was a request, a plea from a man who'd just lost everything. "Okay," she whispered. He led her to the bedroom, and what happened in the dark between them was tender and fierce and utterly consuming, a claiming and a surrender, a promise made in touch and breath and whispered names. And when they finally lay tangled together in the sheets, his hand tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, Scarlett felt the shift between them solidify into something that couldn't be undone. Morning came too soon. Scarlett woke to find Christopher already dressed, standing at the desk in the corner with papers spread across the surface. Financial records, she realized, squinting in the early light. He must have had them sent over. She pulled on his shirt from the night before, the fabric hanging to mid-thigh, and padded across the room to stand beside him. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Answers? Patterns? Anything that tells me who else is involved." His finger traced down a column of numbers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "My mother couldn't have done this alone. She needed resources. Money. People." Scarlett leaned over his shoulder, scanning the documents. Her eye caught on a recurring payment. Same amount. Same date every month. Same account number. "What's this?" She tapped the line. Christopher leaned in, reading the notation. His body went rigid. When he spoke, his voice was ice. "I know this account." He looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. "This is the account I used to pay your tuition." His jaw clenched. "And the account my father used to pay for the hit on your father." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Scarlett stepped back from the desk, from Christopher, from the documents that had just rewritten every assumption she'd made about her life. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs to still them, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. "You paid for my schooling," she said, her voice hollow. "With blood money." Christopher's jaw tightened. "I didn't know. Not until just now. I set up the scholarship fund years ago. Used that account because it had liquidity. I didn't connect it to your father until this moment. But your father did." She felt sick. Felt the room tilting. "Your father used that same account to pay for the hit that killed mine, and then you used it to pay for my education." A bitter laugh escaped her. "What was I? Guilt money? A way to balance the ledger?" "No." "Scarlett." "No." He reached for her, but she jerked away, stumbling backward until her spine hit the wall. The shirt she wore, his shirt, suddenly felt like a brand on her skin. It was an investment in someone who deserved a chance. "I saw your application. Saw your grades, your potential. I didn't know who you were, but you do now." Her throat was tight, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. "And now I know what I am. I'm an asset bought and paid for with my father's blood. I'm a casualty of a war I never asked to fight." She moved along the wall toward the bedroom, toward her clothes, toward escape. "I need to leave." "Scarlett, wait." Christopher moved to block her path, but he didn't touch her, didn't force. His hands hung at his sides, helpless. "Please, let me fix this." "You can't fix this." She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his chest, and the contact burned. Last night she'd been in his arms, had given herself to him completely, and now all of it felt tainted, corrupted by blood and money and sins she couldn't wash clean. "I'm not yours to fix." She made it to the bedroom, found her clothes crumpled on the floor where they'd fallen in the heat of the night. Her hands fumbled with her pants, her shirt, dressing with shaking fingers while tears finally broke free and streamed down her face. Behind her, she heard Christopher in the living room, heard the laptop boot up, the rapid click of keys, heard him on the phone, his voice clipped and cold, giving orders in Italian. When she emerged, dressed and ready to walk out of his life, she found him standing at the desk with his laptop open. On the screen was the account, the blood account, millions in wire transfers, payments made over decades, all of it stained red. Christopher's finger hovered over the keyboard. "Watch," he said. Scarlett wanted to leave, wanted to run and never look back, but something in his voice stopped her. She moved closer, close enough to see the screen. Christopher began typing, his jaw set in grim determination. Transfer after transfer, every cent in that account, redirected. Children's hospitals, scholarship funds for kids who'd lost parents to violence, programs for women escaping abuse. He drained it systematically, ruthlessly, until the balance read 0. "That was your war chest," Scarlett said, her voice breaking. That money was supposed to protect you. It was blood money. My father's sins. And I won't build my life on the bones of innocent people. He closed the laptop and moved to the fireplace, pulling a metal bin from beside it. From the desk drawer, he retrieved a leather-bound ledger, the physical record of every transaction in that cursed account. He dropped it into the bin and pulled a lighter from his pocket. The flame caught, and the ledger began to burn, pages curling and blackening, decades of bloodshed turning to ash. Christopher watched it burn, the firelight casting shadows across his face. And when he finally spoke, his voice was raw. I am not my father. I will never be my father. What he did to your family, what he did to you, I can't undo. But I can choose to be different. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was devastating. And I don't own you, Scarlett. I never did. You don't owe me your life, your loyalty, or another second of your time. He swallowed hard. But I'm asking you to stay. Not as an asset, not as someone I bought, but as someone I chose, and someone who chose me. Scarlett's vision blurred. She wanted to hate him, wanted to walk away and never look back. But standing there, watching him burn his father's legacy to prove he was different, she couldn't. You gave up everything, she whispered. Not everything. His hand reached for hers, tentative, asking permission. I still have you, if you'll let me. She didn't answer with words. She closed the distance between them and buried her face against his chest, her fingers fisting in his shirt. His arms came around her, solid and warm, and they stood there while the ledger burned to ash and smoke curled toward the ceiling. The money was gone. The blood account was empty. But standing in his arms, Scarlett felt something shift. A debt paid, a choice made, a phone buzzed, sharp and insistent. Christopher pulled back, frowning. He moved to the counter where Stefano's phone sat, the one he'd retrieved from the study before they fled. The screen lit up with an incoming text. No name, no number, just a message in Italian. Christopher stared at it, his face draining of color. His hand started to shake. What does it say? Scarlett asked, moving beside him. Christopher's voice was barely a whisper. Dormi, figlio mio. He looked at her, and the devastation in his eyes was complete. Sleep, my son. It's a lullaby. The lullaby my mother used to sing to me when I was a child. He dropped the phone on the counter like it had burned him. It's her. The lullaby was the kill code. She sent this to Stefano the day of the hit. Scarlett's blood ran cold. She ordered your death with a lullaby. She turned the one thing I associated with safety, with love, into a command for my execution. His hands clenched into fists. She didn't just try to kill me. She tried to destroy me. Everything I believed about family, about loyalty, she poisoned it all. He looked at Scarlett, and in his eyes she saw something new. Not just grief, not just rage, but cold, calculated fury. She wants a war. She's going to get one. Christopher stood motionless at the counter, the phone with its damning message still glowing between them. Scarlett watched his face transform, watched the grief and vulnerability that had cracked him open moments ago seal back over with something harder, colder. This was the Don, the man who'd built an empire on calculated violence and strategic ruthlessness, the man who could compartmentalize pain and turn it into a weapon. She sang that to me every night until I was 7, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. When I had nightmares, when I was sick, when my father's world got too loud and too violent, she'd sit on the edge of my bed and sing until I fell asleep. His jaw worked, and now it's the code she used to order my execution. Scarlett moved closer, her hand finding his arm. Christopher, she's not done. He picked up the phone, scrolling through Stefano's messages with clinical precision. There's a commission meeting scheduled for next week. All the families. She's calling it to address the recent security breaches and vote on new leadership. A bitter smile twisted his mouth. She's not coming to vote. She's coming to take the throne, and she's going to use my brother as proof that I'm unfit to lead. Then we stop her. We expose her. With what evidence? A shell casing. A lullaby. He set the phone down, his hand steady now, controlled. She's been planning this for years. She has allies, resources, leverage. If I go in unprepared, she'll bury me and everyone loyal to me. His eyes met Scarlett's, and what she saw there made her chest tighten. I need to draw them all out. Every traitor, every conspirator. I need them confident, visible, so I can cut the rot out at the roots. How? Christopher moved to the windows, looking out over the city as dawnlight began to paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. A merger. The families respect strength, and right now I look weak, under siege. But if I announce an engagement, a strategic alliance with another powerful family, it changes the narrative. It shows I'm still in control, still making moves. He turned to face her, and his expression was carved from stone. Elena Moretti. Her family controls the ports. Her father's been pushing for a union for years. It would be a power play that the commission couldn't ignore. Scarlett's heart stuttered. The word engagement echoed in her head, hollow and devastating. You're going to marry her. I'm going to announce an engagement. Make it public. Throw a party. Invite everyone who matters. His voice was clinical, detached, like he was discussing a business transaction and not the systematic destruction of everything that had grown between them. My mother will come. She won't be able to resist the opportunity to strike when I'm surrounded by witnesses. And when she does, I'll be ready. I see. Scarlett's voice came out steady, controlled, even as something inside her chest shattered into pieces. She'd known better. Known that men like Christopher Bocelli didn't choose Maids over Harris's, didn't trade power for love. Last night had been an aberration, a moment of weakness born from trauma and proximity. Nothing more. That's smart, strategic. Christopher's phone rang. He answered it, speaking in rapid Italian, issuing orders. Scarlett heard the name Elena, heard him confirm meeting times, venue details, guest lists. She stood there in his shirt, barefoot and foolish, and listened to him orchestrate her own heartbreak with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. When he hung up, she found her voice. I should go. You'll need privacy to plan. Scarlett. It's fine, really. She forced a smile that felt like glass cutting her face. You were right earlier. I'm not your asset. I'm not your responsibility. Last night was... She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. Last night was what it was. But we both knew what this is, what you are, what I am. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. She moved past him toward the bedroom, needing distance, needing air, needing to get out before she fell apart completely. Behind her, she heard voices in the hallway, Christopher's men arriving, strategy sessions beginning, the machinery of war grinding to life. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she buttoned her shirt. Through the half-open door, she could hear Christopher and his advisors in the living room, talking about the engagement party, about security, about the guest list and seating arrangements and how to position guards for maximum coverage. And then she heard her name. What about the girl? One of the men asked. She's a liability. She knows too much. Scarlett froze, her hand on the doorknob. She stays protected, Christopher said, his voice hard. 24-hour detail. But she stays away from the party, away from the estate. I want her somewhere safe when this goes down. She could be useful. Bait, maybe, if the mother wants to hurt you. No. The word cracked like a whip. She stays out of it. That's not negotiable. Scarlett's heart twisted. He was protecting her, pushing her away to keep her safe. Part of her wanted to storm back into that room, wanted to demand he let her fight beside him. But the other part, the part that had survived by knowing when to fade into the background, understood. He was doing what he thought was right, and she was doing what she did best, disappearing. She waited until the voices moved to the other side of the penthouse, then slipped out through the front door, made it to the elevator before the first sob broke free. By the time she reached the street, she'd pulled herself together, wrapped the pain in the same armor she'd worn for 18 months. She was good at this, good at being invisible, at surviving grief, at carrying on when everything inside her wanted to break. She made it 3 blocks before her phone rang. Christopher. She let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again. On the 4th call, she answered. What? Where are you? His voice was tight with something she couldn't name. Going home, like you wanted. Scarlett, come back. We need to talk. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice. You're doing what you need to do to survive. I respect that. She stopped walking, leaning against a building, her eyes closed. Good luck with your engagement, Christopher. I hope she makes you happy. She hung up before he could respond, turned off her phone, and for the first time in 12 years, Scarlett Reiner let herself cry in public. Standing on a street corner while the city woke around her and the man she'd fallen for prepared to marry someone else. 3 days later, she received a text from an unknown number, an address, a time, a single line. Staff needed for private event. discretion required. She stared at it for a long time, knowing what it was. The engagement party. They needed servers. And some part of her, the part that was either brave or broken, needed to be there, needed to see it through. She texted back a single word. Yes. The uniform arrived the next day. Black and white, professional, anonymous. She put it on and looked at herself in the mirror. And the woman staring back was the ghost she'd been 18 months ago. Invisible, untouchable, ready to do her job one last time. At the penthouse, Christopher stood alone in the living room after everyone had left. He'd watched Scarlett walk away 3 days ago, had heard the pain in her voice when she'd hung up on him, and every cell in his body had screamed to tell her the truth. But the truth would put her in danger. The spies watching would see through a fake reaction. They'd know she was acting. And his mother would know he was setting a trap. The only way to make this work, the only way to keep Scarlett alive, was to break her heart for real, to make her believe he'd chosen power over her, to push her so far away that no one would think to use her against him. He looked down at the engagement announcement on his phone, the photo of him and Elena, perfect and cold and strategically positioned. His phone buzzed with a message from security. Scarlett Reiner confirmed for server duty at the event. His chest tightened. She was coming. She was going to stand there and watch him play the devoted fiancé while her heart broke, and it was his fault. All of it. Christopher whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking on the words, "Forgive me." The silence of the penthouse was the only answer. A heavy quiet that would stretch over the next 3 agonizing days. The ballroom was a study in calculated perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in silk the color of champagne. Arrangements of white roses and orchids perfumed the air, their scent almost cloying in its sweetness. The guest list read like a who's who of organized crime, each family represented by their most powerful members, all of them dressed in designer suits and gowns that whispered wealth and violence in equal measure. Scarlett moved through it all like smoke, her uniform pressed and perfect, her hair pulled back so tight it made her scalp ache, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She was invisible again. Just another server carrying trays of champagne and canapes, refilling glasses, clearing plates. No one looked at her. No one saw the way her hands trembled when she wasn't carrying something, or the red rims around her eyes that no amount of concealer could quite hide. She'd cried herself empty over the past 3 days, and what remained was a hollow ache that sat in her chest like a stone. Christopher stood near the center of the room, devastating in a black tuxedo that fit him like it had been painted on. The tattoo on his neck was just visible above his collar, that skeleton key that she'd traced with her fingers in the dark. He was playing his role perfectly, the confident Don announcing his engagement, his future secured through strategic alliance. He smiled and shook hands and accepted congratulations with the ease of a man born to this world. And then Elena Moretti arrived, and the air in the room shifted. She was beautiful in the way weapons were beautiful, all sharp edges and cold precision. Her gown was crimson silk that clung to her like blood, and her dark hair was swept up to showcase a neck adorned with diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, her hand possessive on Christopher's arm when she reached him, her smile cold and satisfied. Scarlett watched from her position near the champagne station and felt something inside her die a little more. Christopher looked at Elena with polite attention, played the part of the devoted fiancé, and never once let his gaze wander to where Scarlett stood in the shadows. She told herself it was better this way, cleaner. He'd made his choice, and she'd made hers. She'd come here to do a job, and when it was done, she'd disappear back into the life she'd built on survival and silence. The toast came an hour into the party. Christopher's second-in-command called for attention, and the room quieted, glasses raised. Scarlett circulated with a tray, refilling champagne flutes, her movements automatic. She approached Christopher's table, filling glasses for the guests seated there, and that's when she saw it. Elena's hand, resting casually on the table, fingers toying with the ring on her right hand. It was ornate, oversized, with a large stone that seemed too bulky for fashion. Scarlett's instincts, honed by years of watching for danger, prickled. Elena's fingers moved over the ring with practiced ease, and Scarlett saw the stone shift, revealing a tiny compartment beneath. A ring with a hidden chamber. A poison ring. Her blood went cold. She watched as Elena lifted her champagne glass with her left hand, her right hand hovering over Christopher's glass for just a fraction of a second. A fine white powder drifted down, invisible against the bubbles, dissolving instantly. Scarlett's mind raced. She couldn't shout, couldn't cause a scene without starting a massacre in a room full of armed men with hair-trigger tempers. She set down her tray with hands that had gone numb and began moving through the crowd. Christopher stood, raising his glass, and began his speech, thanking the families for their support, for their presence, for their faith in this union. His voice was smooth, controlled, and Scarlett could hear the hollowness beneath it, the performance of a man doing what needed to be done. His eyes found hers across the room, just for a second. And in that second, she saw everything. The apology, the regret, the silent plea for understanding. He thought he was protecting her, thought pushing her away would keep her safe. And maybe it would have, if she were the kind of person who could stand by and watch him die. Christopher raised the poisoned glass to his lips. The room held its breath, waiting for the toast to conclude, and Scarlett ran. She didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh the consequences. She just moved, her feet carrying her across the ballroom in a sprint that turned heads, that broke through the careful choreography of the evening. She reached Christopher just as the glass touched his lips and slapped it from his hand with enough force that crystal exploded against the marble floor. The sound of shattering glass was deafening in the sudden silence. Champagne and blood sprayed across the white tablecloth, crimson on pristine white. Scarlett's palm was shredded, glass embedded in her skin, but she didn't feel it. She only felt Christopher's hand catching hers, his fingers wrapping around her bleeding palm, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked dangerously close to devastation. Scarlett. Her name was a broken sound on his lips. He looked down at her hand, at the blood dripping between his fingers, at the glass shards glittering in her torn flesh. Then he looked at Elena, who'd gone white, her eyes darting to the exits. Get out. Elena opened her mouth to protest, to play innocent. But Christopher's voice cut through whatever lie she'd prepared. You have 3 seconds to leave this building before I have you dragged out. 1. Elena stood, her chair scraping back. You don't understand. Your mother. 2. She ran, heels clicking on marble, crimson silk flying behind her. She fled through the crowd and out the main doors. The guests erupted into confused murmurs, security moving to intercept her. Christopher turned back to Scarlett, his hand still wrapped around hers, and pulled her against him, away from the crowd, into the shadow of a marble column. It was fake. The words came out raw, desperate. Scarlett, the engagement, all of it. Elena was working with my mother. I needed them to believe I'd moved on, that you meant nothing to me, so they'd make their move. His thumb brushed across her uninjured knuckles. I needed your reaction to be real, so the spies would buy it, so they wouldn't use you against me. Scarlett stared at him, her mind struggling to process. You broke my heart on purpose. I hated every second of it, watching you hurt, knowing I was the one hurting you. His voice cracked. But I thought it was the only way to keep you alive. If they believed you meant nothing, they wouldn't target you. You're an idiot. Her voice shook, caught between rage and relief. Did it ever occur to you to just tell me? To let me help you set the trap? And risk you getting killed if something went wrong? No. His hand cupped her face, his touch gentle despite the blood. You've saved my life 3 times, Scarlett. I needed to save yours. She should have been furious, should have pushed him away and walked out. But looking at him, seeing the fear and guilt and desperate love in his eyes, she couldn't. Don't ever lie to me again. Never. I swear it. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. It was always you. Every second of every day, it was only ever you. Before she could respond, before she could kiss him or hit him or both, the main doors burst open with a crash that silenced the room. Security moved to intercept, but the woman who entered didn't flinch. She was elegant, silver-haired, dressed in black that made her look like she was attending a funeral. Christopher's mother, and beside her, like a ghost made flesh, stood a younger man with Christopher's eyes and Christopher's face and a rifle slung across his back. Julian, alive, armed, staring at his brother with eyes that held no recognition, only cold, calculated hatred. Christopher's arm wrapped protectively around Scarlett, pulling her behind him. His mother smiled. And it was the smile of a woman who'd won a war before it had even begun. She said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Just like your father. The ballroom was a frozen tableau. Every gun in the room trained on someone else. Every breath held, every heartbeat suspended. Scarlett felt Christopher's body tense against hers, his arm still wrapped protectively around her waist, her bleeding hand still clutched in his. His mother stood 20 feet away, imperious and cold, and beside her Julian stood with his rifle raised, the barrel pointed directly at Christopher's chest. Julian. Christopher's mother didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Kill him. Julian's finger moved to the trigger, but his eyes, Christopher's eyes, were locked on his brother's face. On the way, Christopher held the bleeding woman, on the blood dripping between Christopher's fingers, crimson against pale skin, on the protective stance, the way Christopher had positioned his body as a shield. Julian's jaw clenched. The rifle wavered. Jules. Christopher's voice was soft, stripped of authority, stripped of everything except raw emotion. He wasn't speaking as a Don. He was speaking as a brother. I know what she told you. I know you think I tried to kill you, but look at me. Really look at me. When have I ever lied to you? You wanted me dead. Julian's voice was rough, unused, like he hadn't spoken in years. You wanted the throne to yourself. I wanted you safe. Christopher's hand tightened on Scarlett's. I wanted you out of this life because you deserved better. You always deserved better. And when I thought you died, when I stood at your empty grave, something inside me broke that never healed. His voice cracked. You're my brother. I would have burned this entire empire to the ground if it meant keeping you alive. Julian's rifle lowered an inch, then another. Confusion flickered across his face, cracks forming in the conditioning that had been so carefully constructed. She said, she lied. Christopher took a step forward, and Scarlett moved with him, their bodies still connected. She used your kindness, your trust, and she turned you into a weapon. But you're still my brother, and I'm still yours. The rifle dropped. Not completely, but enough. Julian's hands shook, his breath coming faster, and Scarlett saw the moment the brainwashing shattered, saw the recognition flood back into his eyes, saw the horror of what he'd almost done, what he'd been made to do. Chris? Christopher's mother moved faster than Scarlett would have thought possible for a woman her age. Her hand emerged from her clutch with a small pistol, elegant and deadly. She didn't aim it at Christopher. She aimed it at Scarlett, at the variable she couldn't control, at the woman who'd saved her son 3 times when she should have been invisible and powerless. You, she hissed. This is all because of you. Christopher saw the gun, saw where it was aimed, and he didn't hesitate. He spun, his body colliding with Scarlett's, his arms wrapping around her as he turned them both. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Christopher's body jerked against hers, and she felt the impact, felt him absorb the bullet that had been meant for her heart. He staggered, but didn't fall, his hand pressing against his shoulder where blood was already seeping through his tuxedo jacket. The ballroom erupted. Security swarmed forward. Julian dropped his rifle completely and launched himself at the mercenaries his mother had brought, tackling them with the kind of violence that came from years of suppressed rage, finally finding a target. Guests screamed and dove for cover. And Christopher's mother, seeing her plan disintegrate, her carefully constructed coup falling apart, turned and ran for the boardroom doors at the far end of the ballroom. Scarlett didn't think. She moved on pure instinct, pure muscle memory, from a life spent anticipating danger. She was closer to the doors than the mother, faster in her flat server shoes than the older woman was in heels. She reached the heavy oak doors 3 steps ahead and threw her whole weight against them. They slammed shut with a sound like thunder, the same definitive thud that had sealed Stefano's fate in Christopher's study all those weeks ago. Her hands found the deadbolt, slick with her own blood, and she drove it home. Click. The same sound that had started everything. The same sound that had saved Christopher's life the first time. The mother hit the doors a second later, pounding, screaming threats and promises of vengeance. But the doors were solid, the lock engaged, and on the other side Christopher's guards were already moving in to secure the perimeter. Scarlett turned from the door, her bleeding hand leaving red prints on the polished brass, and found Christopher watching her. He was pale from blood loss, his hand pressed against his shoulder, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. You locked the door, he said, and there was wonder in his voice. Wonder and something that looked dangerously close to love. I wanted to keep the trash out, she replied, her voice shaking with adrenaline and relief, and about a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. He crossed to her in 3 strides, one arm hanging useless at his side, the other reaching for her. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. You saved me, again. You took a bullet for me. I'd say we're even. We'll never be even. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you've given me. 2 months later, Scarlett stood outside a modest apartment building in a quiet neighborhood far from estates and empires, and the weight of blood-soaked legacies. She was in scrubs, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a textbook tucked under her arm. Nursing school was harder than she'd expected, demanding in ways that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with healing. She loved it. A familiar black car pulled up to the curb. Christopher emerged, and Scarlett's breath caught the way it always did when she saw him. He wasn't in a suit, just jeans and a dark sweater, his hair slightly mussed, his arm no longer in a sling. The empire had been restructured, the rot cut out, the illegal operations either legitimized or shuttered. Julian was in therapy, working through 3 years of trauma and brainwashing, slowly becoming himself again. And Christopher was learning how to be something other than a Don, learning how to be just a man. He walked up to her, a small smile playing at his lips. "You locked the door." "I wanted to keep the trash out," she replied, echoing their words from that night. Christopher reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Simple brass, newly cut, attached to a keychain with no markings. He held it out to her, his expression serious. "It's not to a safe house. It's not to a fortress. It's just home. Mine, ours, if you want it." He swallowed. "And this time you don't have to knock." Scarlett took the key, her fingers closing around the cool metal, around the promise it represented. A future built on choice instead of survival, on trust instead of necessity, on love instead of strategy. She stepped into his space, her free hand finding his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. "I want it," she whispered. "I want you. All of it." He kissed her there on the sidewalk, gentle and deep and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, he laced his fingers through hers, the scars on her palm pressing against the scars on his. Two people who'd survived the dark and found each other in the wreckage. They walked toward his car together, toward whatever came next. And Scarlett realized that for the first time in 12 years, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't a ghost. She was seen, known, and chosen. And she'd finally found a door she wanted to walk through instead of locking behind her. The door is locked, and the threat is gone. But the family is just getting started. If Christopher and Scarlett's intense journey kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to show your loyalty. It helps us bring more stories out of the shadows. And I have a question for you. Be honest. When Christopher announced the fake engagement to protect Scarlett, would you have stayed to save him like she did? Or would you have walked away forever? Tell me your choice in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell notification. In this world, you can't afford to miss what happens next. Until next time, keep your secrets close.